I want this video to serve as a sort of follow-up to the last one, but also exploring the specific issue of the right's attitude to British-Israel relations. Because predictably, the right has absolutely came out for Starmer and Lammy with their decision to cut off some of the arms to Israel. Um, some of them, in fact, it's quite a small proportion. And the thing is, this was always going to get criticism no matter what way it was done, because for the left, it doesn't go far enough. And for the right, well, it's a betrayal of Israel. It's just going to embolden Hamas and Iran. I've just looked at the Times editorial piece on this from yesterday's Times, and they describe it as Britain's arms embargo against Israel as a model of ham-fisted diplomacy. Um, I think a lot of this criticism is, I mean, it has to be said, the Times is sort of centre right as opposed to certainly not quite as hard right as the Telegraph would be. But it's in the Sun, there was a pathetic article comparing Keir Starmer to Jeremy Corbyn on this, saying there's virtually no difference between them. Now that is clearly nonsense. Um, clearly nonsense. You would never have seen Jeremy Corbyn clearly stating that he believes Israel has a right to defend itself, for example, and unequivocally, specifically condemning Hamas. What Corbyn would have done is a generic condemnation of violence, but refusing to get into the specifics of condemning Hamas. Starmer has clearly done that. Um, I think this editorial piece is very omitting of the, the the elephant in the room, namely the horrendous civilian death toll in Gaza. I mean, it talks about this unforced error, which will not help the tormented people of Gaza and appears to have caught the Americans unawares. It's kind of brushing it aside. Oh, the tormented people of Gaza, but let's not call it what it is. Tens of thousands of Palestinians killed as a direct result, killed, wounded, and displaced as a direct result of Israel's action. Now, I'll be very honest about this. I personally went through something of a, I wouldn't say U-turn, but I have adapted my stance on this from October the 7th. Like any normal person, I was utterly disgusted and horrified by what happened that day. It was a brazen terrorist attack on Israeli civilians. And what Hamas has done with the hostages is utterly inhumane. Remember, there's still a lot of hostages there. It's utterly inhumane. And every decent person has condemned that. The UN has condemned that. The British government has condemned that. So that, there should be no issues over that, over condemnation of what Hamas has done with the hostages. But there is, I think, a lot of questions to be asked about why we have this blind, unwavering support for Israel, no matter what it does. Um, the rebuttal from Tel Aviv, from Netanyahu's government, and from right wingers in the UK, and it is predominantly the right. I'm not just playing the right left game here, it is predominantly from the right, is that it's a betrayal of Israel. But surely there's a fundamental question, A, about Britain's obligations to abide by international law, which includes arms supplies, but also surely we have a right as a sovereign nation state to know how weapons we are supplying is used. Now, there could be an argument that we should extend this, for example, to Saudi Arabia, which has used weapons on Yemeni civilians. I would argue that we should definitely also review that. Otherwise, it can be perceived as kind of picking on the Jewish state. But I do think Netanyahu does this himself. There is this dangerous tendency for criticism of Israel to automatically be met by charges of anti Semitism. Uh, some of the biggest critics of Israel are Jewish academics. And in Israeli society right now, we see a huge backlash against Netanyahu, massive protests. Bear in mind, Israel only has 9 million people, and there's hundreds of thousands on the street. So there's clearly deep dissatisfaction with Netanyahu's government, um, because I think people in Israel feel that rather than prioritizing the hostages, he's prioritizing, taking out Hamas. Um, the indication seems to be that these people on the streets would rather see some sort of negotiation to free the hostages now versus the continued military campaign to wipe out Hamas. I don't think it's practically possible. Even if you kill thousands of Hamas fighters, even if you kill their leaders, unfortunately, it's very difficult because of the nature of how they operate to just wipe it out completely. I actually have no major moral issues with Hamas leaders being killed on the grounds that they are directly responsible for terrorist attacks on Israel. And I think there's a stronger moral argument to that rather than killing entire Palestinian families. And they can call it collateral damage. They can call it, you know, it's a term I absolutely hate. It's absolutely dehumanizing. Um, but it's worth bearing in mind the British position on this, watered down as it is, and probably it will make little actual difference on the ground. It's actually in keeping with the international trajectory. And I'm just going to read out here from the Times the contribution of other Western powers to Israel. Um, Goes without saying, America's just unwavering in its support, so that isn't even a question. Germany is actually a major supplier of Israel, but even Germany um, has watered down its supplies this year. Just read this out. Figures used by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that from 2019 to last year, the US and Germany provided 99% of Israel's arms imports. So actually, the British contribution is very small by comparison. The figures gave greater weight to bigger and more advanced weapons. In May, the US delayed a shipment of bombs and threatened to halt them if Israel invaded Rafah and southern Gaza. The Biden administration, if you recall, was making these warnings to Israel. Despite that, last month President Biden approved more than 20 billion in weapon sales for the country, including 50 F-15 fighter jets and 33,000 tank cartridges. I think on the domestic basis in the US, Biden and Harris will be accused of breaking their own red lines. You know, they condemn the deaths of civilians, but continue this unwavering support for Israel at an arms level. The US also handed over 14,000 rounds of tank ammunition worth $106 million and $147 million of components for the manufacture of 155 millimeter artillery shells. The Americans also provide Israel with a 3.8 billion in annual military aid as part of a 10-year agreement aimed at maintaining the country's defense superiority over its neighbors. By the way, before I continue this, I am going to be talking about Iran and Hamas, so I will talk about that. Germany supplied arms worth $326.5 million last year, but has approved considerably fewer exports since the start of the year as criticism of Israel's tactics have mounted. Germany is something of a unique situation for obvious reasons, for history. You know, a country that was largely responsible for perpetrating the Holocaust is it's an unsettled thing, I think, in German society to criticize Israel, an unsettling thing. But like every other democracy, that there should be a capability for that without, being without overlapping with anti-Semitism. Um, I mean, it's almost taboo in Germany more than in other Western countries for obvious reasons. Italy, which provided 0.9% of Israel's import arms in 2019 to 2023, believed to include helicopters and naval artillery, halted new export approvals after the start of the Gaza war. Under Italian law, arms exports are banned to countries that are waging war and those deemed to be violating international human rights. Last year, Canada exported military goods and technology worth $22.2 million to Israel, but has not granted any new export licenses since January the 20th. And in February, a Dutch court blocked the sale of F-35 parts to Israel, ruling there was a clear risk of humanitarian violations. So the British position on this is only in keeping with most other Western countries, except for the United States and to a lesser extent Germany. Well, actually, even Germany has scaled back. So really, what it comes down to, up until this decision by David Lammy, um, it was really only Britain and America that was unwavering and unquestioning its support for Israel. I must admit, I was surprised at how little Britain actually contributes. I knew America would be the vast bulk, but I did think we'd be a little bit more than that. So, in terms of actual practical realities on the ground, it might be minimal. But there is a point here about international law as well as, frankly, our international reputation. Um, and I do have a problem with this mentality that because Israel has been a victim of Islamist terrorism, because Israel has had its very existence threatened, hugely important as that is, it shouldn't mean that we have this kind of attitude where we just give the green light for Israel to do as it pleases. Um, and I'm tired of the right downplaying Palestinian suffering. You know, you'll kind of mention it, oh, it's awful what the Palestinians are going through, but it's entirely the fault of Hamas. I hold Hamas responsible for starting this war, this latest war, absolutely, because they made the decision to attack Israel, knowing full well Israel would hit back hard. It shows Hamas's callousness towards the Palestinian civilians. It's well established that Hamas deny it as they will, hide among civilians, etc. But Hamas is a terrorist organization. Should a nation state basically reduce its tactics to the same level as a terrorist organization? And if you've had your entire family wiped out, the suffering of a Palestinian family have gone through that versus an Israeli family who's had their family wiped in a kibbutz is a really fundamentally immoral difference. When Israel is not doing, people will say, oh, but Israel doesn't deliberately kill them. I don't really buy that because Israel it must know that when it was making strikes on hospitals and schools and refugee camps, there is going to be mass civilian casualties. So I don't really buy this argument that it's not deliberate. It is deliberate. It's a military policy. And I think it is a scorched earth policy. I think hardliners in the Israeli government basically want to bring Gaza back to the Stone Age. I honestly think that's the mentality. And there is empirical evidence for this because there's far right figures in Netanyahu's government that want the dust has been swept away from Gaza, build settlements there. So I don't accept the argument this is purely a defensive war. Um, of course, the Israeli position has to be considered. It is being assaulted on all fronts. I think Iran is toxic. Iran should stay the hell out of this. And I absolutely support as much pressure as possible on the Iranian regime. So, if Israel's just criticized, that would be understandable if it will wait a second about Iran. But this country has very frosty relations with Iran. We do sanction Iran, and we've designated Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations. So it's not a case that we're criticizing Israel and somehow paying lip service to Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. I don't think that's the case. I mean, if that's the position that pro Israelis want to conclude, then that is most of the world. That is most of the world, including even in Israel itself. I think there will be Israelis who are well aware of the mass civilian casualties in Gaza, and they know this will be damaging Israel's international reputation. Now, I'm not naive. I do not say that Israel should just stand back and do nothing. Absolutely not. That would be utterly unrealistic and unreasonable when it's being bombarded with rockets that are designed to kill Israeli civilians. And as we know from October the 7th, Hamas absolutely cannot be trusted. Um, so perhaps it could have been useful for Starmer and Lammy to also issue some sort of communique or something for some sort of increased sanctions on Hamas or something like that, because unfortunately it's led into this allegation that it's all one-sided. I don't think that's the case actually, and I think comparing Starmer to Corbyn is obscene. It's just utterly misplaced. Um, but just finding something stuck in my newspaper there. That was anyway. We need to get away from this idea that any criticism of Israel or any notion that we're not going to align with Israel breaking international humanitarian law somehow equates to being pro Hamas, or even more ridiculously, it's somehow anti Semitic. Frankly, there are very right wing pro Israelis out there who will constantly use anti Semitism as a way to silence criticism of Israel. Um, Broadly speaking, I'm not anti Israel. I would not describe myself as anti Israel. I am anti collective punishment of the Palestinians. I am anti the notion that Israel cannot, that it should somehow be above reproach. And Britain has a unique history with this. Obviously, the Balfour Declaration, helped to set up the State of Israel. So Britain has a history with Israel that does differ from other European and other Western powers. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean we should be constantly obliged to blindly support the Israeli state. Um, Israel's a sovereign state, Britain's a sovereign state. I don't actually think we should blindly support any ally. I mean, even Ukraine, I think the situations are different. But let's say Ukraine was to start mass killing Russian civilians and call it defense, I'd have a problem with that. But Ukraine is not doing that. The contrast between Ukraine's campaign in Kursk versus Russia's brutality in Ukraine is striking. So some may compare Ukraine and Israel and talk about double standards there, but the two situations are different. Basically, at this point, I'm pretty solid in my support for Ukraine. I must admit I'm far less comfortable with blind support for Israel because Israel's campaign has directly killed thousands of civilians. Ukraine hasn't. I'm not going to say there's no casualties in Russia, but it's minimal compared to what civilian casualties compared to what Israel's been doing. Um, so yeah, I just think it's unfortunate that the right has this knee-jerk reaction and they just dismiss Palestinian suffering. The Times editorial, and the Times is a paper I respect. I think it's an objective paper for the most part, and it's certainly less reactionary and knee-jerk than, say, the Sun or the Daily Mail. I mean, they'll absolutely be calling Starmer, a poodle of Iran and all this sort of nonsense. But what frustrates me is the fact that Times and other right wing publications are just downplaying the international component of this. The fact that Britain's position is simply in keeping with international law, international opinion, and that shouldn't be downplayed. Why should we always just blindly support Israel and go along with what the American position is? We need to reassess that attitude. We are a sovereign country. Um, and I think it's completely legitimate for the British government to question how British weapons are being used. Of course, it should be consistent. I think we should also review arms to Saudi Arabia. Um, and the argument, oh, well, someone else will supply them, I don't think that's really good enough. This isn't necessarily about practicalities on the ground. I think it's more about international reputation. I mean, frankly, if we cut off all our arms to Israel, it would make little difference because America would still supply a massive amount. But at least we won't be tied in with that. So for example, the reason this is significant is because when we lecture countries on human rights, they'll just turn around and say you armed Israel while it was killing Palestinian civilians. So I think it actually weakens some of our international arguments. As a patriot, I think it is actually sensible from a national geopolitical point of view. That's my take on it. People are free to disagree.